All right, so hello everyone. My name is Dr. Espino Perez, and today um, we'll be talking about our first lecture for the class, which is about an introduction to psychology. So we're going to be very broad in our discussion of introduction to psychology today, and then we'll get more into the nitty-gritty details as we continue going through course material. All right. So I thought I would give you some information about who I am, especially since you won't be seeing me in real life. And I also think it's important that as college students, you sort of know who your professors are, just so you get an idea of like where they were educated, what kinds of ideas they might have, and what kind of research they do, because that could help inform the way that they teach. And I'll also start talking to you about what science is, why we should study psychology, and some information about psychology careers. So, who am I? I'm Dr. Kathy Espino Perez. I'm from California, and I went to Cal State Northridge for my undergrad and master's, which is a school very much like Western Oregon. I got my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and I did something called a postdoctoral training at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. So let me see if I can get this working. So this is me when I was completing my master's degree. That's the campus of Cal State Northridge. There's a lot of shows that are um, recorded there. And our mascot was the Matadors, although I prefer Woo Wolves. So what kind of work or research do I do? So we'll be talking about the different branches of psychology. But I myself am a social psychologist, and what that means is that I study how the real, imagined, or implied presence of others affects people's affect, behavior, and cognition. More specifically, my work focuses on prejudice, discrimination, and stigma. And this image, you can probably imagine, is from the mid 1900s, where there were explicit messages against people of color, like white women and colored women were supposed to go this way, whereas white men and colored men were supposed to go this way. We can see a black man drinking from a colored water fountain. What I'm interested in exploring currently is how perceptions of prejudice have changed across time. I'm actually finding some interesting results where white people are reporting more perceptions of prejudice against people of color than people of color themselves are reporting. So, my research lab and I are investigating why these things might be happening now. All right, who am I? I'm also a mom. This is my 3-year-old, Diego, and my husband. And why should you know that? Well, because it benefits you. You should have already read, yes, read through the syllabus. And in the syllabus, I say that all assignments, except the final exam and anything during finals week, has an extended deadline. So all assignments are typically due on a Sunday, but I give you some flex due dates because my son will likely get sick and that might lead me to falling a little behind with grading. So because of your understanding and flexibility with me regarding that, I will give you an extra 3 days to complete your assignments. So although most assignments are due on a Sunday, you are allowed to complete your assignments up until Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. without any um, negative consequences to your grade. So for our first forum, which will be due this Sunday, I want you to share your name, your year in school, something personal, something professional, and something interesting about yourself. Um, so I guess I could share something too. Personal, I'm a mom, I have a 3-year-old. Um, I really like spending time with my son and seeing how he grows. And it's really interesting as a psychologist applying all the theories to my son. And it's just incredible seeing someone grow from sort of a sentient potato who can't really communicate to now this kid who talks about his own ideas and his own stories. And he tells himself stories at night when we go to bed. Professional. My ultimate goal was to become a professor, which I've now achieved that. So now, because I've achieved that goal, I really want to make the educational space for higher ed, like college and graduate school, more equitable for people that are first generation, low income, and or racial and ethnic minorities. So that's what one of my professional goals is. Something interesting about me, I'm not a very good dancer, or I don't think so at least. I love dancing. Um, but I once won a radio contest that was at a fair. It was hosted by a radio um, station. I once won a dance contest for that. All right. So you've read about the syllabus. So just generally, when you finish this class, I want you to understand or have a general knowledge of the theories and current findings in psychological science. I also want you to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the methods underlying psychological research. So how do we conduct our research? And I also want you to understand how basic theory and experimental findings are informed by and or apply to everyday situations. Our textbook. So this is kind of a poor background, but we're just gonna roll with it. Roll with it. So for the exams, everyone always has questions about exams. There will be both multiple choice and short answer questions. So this is also so that I can gauge more of your conceptual understanding and not just your rote memorization. Um, the way that I'm going to be taking account of class participation is through your participation in our forums. I also encourage you to come to my office hours. So look at the office hours that are available on my syllabus. So these hours are a time that I've set aside to be available to speak with you about your class topics, career options that you might be interested in, interest in my research, or any other topic relating to psychology. Office hours are really important for you to take advantage of while you're here. One of the reasons why you might want to seek me out for office hours is that you will probably need someone to write a lot of recommendation for you if you're planning on going to graduate school. And by establishing good relationships with your professors, both in class and during office hours, is one way that you can establish those relationships. All right. What are some research-backed tips for doing well in class? Read the assigned readings. Oh, another thing I forgot to say about the textbook. The textbook is free. You get to see it online. There's also a link to the textbook in the syllabus that I included. So you can read the textbook online. You can read it on your phone. You can read it on your iPad. You can read it on all these different sorts of devices. If you prefer, you can also read um, the textbook by ordering a physical copy. So there should be no reason why you don't read the assigned readings. I want you to practice the material and practice it frequently. Take good notes by hand and review your notes before each class. Let me know if you have any questions and really keep track of how you're doing. All right, let's move on to some lecture material. What is psychology? Often when we think about psychology, or when I tell people I'm a psychologist, they're like, "Ooh, can you read my mind?" Or um, I don't want to say too much because you might find out all my different traumas. As psychologists, no matter what field you're in, even if you're a clinical psychologist, you can't tell too much about a person, especially upon first meeting them. So I would not worry about that. But what is psychology? So generally, it's not that. Psychology generally um, comes from the Latin words psyche, which means soul or spirit, and logia, which is the study or knowledge. So what psychology is very broadly is the scientific study of the mind and your behavior. So your mind tends to be this intangible thing if you think about the mind or your thought processes as being separate from your physical brain and your behavior. So how do we convert these intangible things, things you can't touch, into something that you can actually observe behavior? And this is often referred to as psychological science. If you look at our departmental website, you'll see that we are the Department of Psychological Science. And this is interesting because often when people think about science, They don't think about psychology. If I would ask you to tell me a few fields in science, you would probably say something like biology or chemistry. But I'm going to tell you why psychology is a science as we go through the lecture. Some topics that psychologists study include questions like, do racial and ethnic minorities distrust white people? If so, why? And what are the consequences of this? Are certain areas of the brain responsible for experiencing physical pain? And do these areas overlap with the experience of emotional pain? The answer to that is yes. Why do we forget some things? And why are some people smarter than others? So these are some questions that are really broad, right? We go from the experience of racial and ethnic minorities and white individuals, so how they relate to one another, to the physical brain, to memories, to intelligence. So the topics that psychologists study are really broad. What about the history of psychology? Well, it all started with William Wundt and structuralism. So William Wundt and all the structuralists believed that the goal of psychology was to identify components of consciousness and how these components would fit into our conscious experience. So they argued that in order for us to understand our psychology or the way that we think, we needed to look within. So if we thought that our favorite food or our favorite fruit was an apple, then we would look within and we would say something like, well, my favorite food is an apple, and I think the reason why my favorite food is an apple because my earliest memory is of my mom feeding me sliced apples with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And now that I think of it, well, maybe a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is my favorite kind of sandwich, and so on and so forth. So Titchener, who was William Wundt's student, is the person who developed structuralism, although Wundt is thought to be the father of structuralism. And structuralists tended to focus more on mental processes, so how you go about thinking rather than why we think. They also did a lot of reaction time studies, so how quickly could someone ask you to think of a fruit and how quickly you would respond with a fruit. And although they did develop introspection, introspection wasn't widely accepted. And we'll talk a little bit about why introspection might not be the best, because our memories aren't always accurate, and we tend to build narratives in our head that sort of make sense. After structuralism, there was functionalism, and the people that are most associated with functionalism include William James, John Dewey, and Charles Sanders Peirce. So, as a social psychologist, the father of psychology that I always claim is William James. So, functionalists really endorsed Darwin's theory of natural selection and applied this theory, which was normally applied to genetic variability, to the way that we think and how that could contribute to genetic variability. So, the theory of natural selection, as you all know, argues that adaptation occurs because the trait of an organism has a function for survival and the reproduction of an individual that has been naturally selected. So, for instance, an adaptive trait may have been hunters who were really skilled at hunting different animals might have been more likely to pass on their genes because they were able to gain a mate and therefore reproduce. And the skill of hunting is considered an adaptive process. So that's sort of how we've thought about adaptation. But what William James and his colleagues argued was that not only do we engage in behaviors that might improve our evolutionary fitness, but we can engage in mental activities that help the organism fit the environment. So, one way that you can think about this is whether optimism or pessimism leads to better survival. So historically, through our evolutionary processes, I would argue, and you could argue another point, but I would argue that pessimists probably had a better chance of surviving and a better chance of promoting their genetic material because they were probably more likely to consider all negative effects of the environment and to plan ahead, right? Whereas optimists might have been eaten by a wolf because they weren't careful enough and they thought that they would be safe no matter what. So these are the kind of mental activities or mental differences that existed that could promote the propagation of certain traits. They were also interested in whole versus part of the mind. So, how does the entire mind affect evolutionary processes? And for these researchers, they included recording devices, physiology, and anatomy. So, they looked at how the mind and the body worked together. Someone you may have heard about before even taking this class is Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalytic theory. I will say that a lot of Sigmund Freud's research has been debunked, so there isn't a lot of scientific support for his research, but we still have to acknowledge that he is one of the most well-known psychologists and he did further the field. So what Freud focused on is or are mental health um, disorders that he named hysteria and neuroses. Hysteria is where the word hysterectomy comes from, and hysteria generally was known as exaggerated emotional expressions, and most of the people that were diagnosed with hysteria were women. What he argued was that emotional disturbances arose from the unconscious mind. So it could be a memory from when you were a child that makes you currently not like men, for instance. So what he argued is that psychologists needed to gain access to the unconscious mind in order to fix problems. So the way that he would do that is by using hypnosis or by trying to talk to you and to get you to tap into your unconscious mind. And by rewiring those unconscious connections, you could eliminate your hysteria. Some of the other techniques that he used included dream analysis. So once you woke up from your dream, you would write down as much as, or once you woke up from sleep, you would try to write down as much as you could remember from the dreams that you had. He argued that when you dreamed, you were processing a lot of the information from either the day before or your entire life. And dreaming was sort of a way for you to be able to process any unconscious struggles that you may be enduring in your life or in your day-to-day life. He also argued that slips of the tongue gave access to people's unconscious mind, and all of this was known as psychoanalytic theory, which is the unconscious and how early childhood experiences could determine people's emotional states. If you want to read more information about this, you can. It'll be included in our textbook, and we will come back to this at some point. But today I just want to give you a broad overview. Then we had Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler, and Gestalt psychology. So what Gestalt means is a whole. So you focus on the whole and not just the parts. So these researchers argued that sensory experiences should be evaluated as a whole and not individual parts. So when you see something, it's not just your eyes that are observing this image, it's also your brain that's observing this image. And your brain is taking this image of an apple that you're looking at and connecting it to all the different memories you have associated with apples. It also connects it to the kinds of tastes and smells and sounds you have associated with an apple. So you can imagine eating a green apple and how that tastes a lot more tart than maybe a Fuji apple, which would taste more sweet, and how it sounds like to bite into an apple, what it feels like. And I can even feel my mouth watering right now as I'm talking about the apple, but that's what these researchers argued about. Many of these researchers were in Germany, so Gestalt is a German word, And they came to the US seeking refuge during the 1940s, during Nazi Germany. And they also considered humans as whole versus part. So it's not just your brain that determines what you think, but your way of thinking is influenced by your body, by your memories, by tangible and intangible things. All right. So, just as a review, structuralists studied the content of the mind. Functionalists studied the function of the mind, and they used evolution to do that. Psychoanalysts focused on how human beings are driven by conflicts and how these conflicts exist below conscious awareness. We didn't talk about behaviorists, but it'll be a brief overview. So behaviorists argued that all of the other researchers, the structuralists, the functionalists, and the psychoanalysts, were really not engaging in science. Because how can we know what people's unconscious minds or what they're reporting as their unconscious mind is true? What they argued is that only things that we can observe, so people's behavior, is what we can study scientifically. So that's what they focused on. Humanists then emphasized individuals' dignity and worth and people's free will. And these people included Carl Rogers and Maslow, and which we'll talk about them at some point, at other points during the term. All right, so let's talk about the different fields of study. Beyond like the history of psychology, let's talk about the fields of study. One field of study is called developmental psychology. And in developmental psychology, we focus on the ways that people can change psychologically across the lifespan. So, for instance, I was talking about my son earlier, and when he was born, he probably only had a few drives. So, a hunger drive and a sleep drive. And he needed to be kept at a certain temperature. He needed to be clean and not soiled, and so on and so forth. So the only thing that he knew to do to communicate a need, either to be changed, to be wrapped, to be cuddled, or to be fed, was to cry. So that was the, it was basically just thinking something is wrong, I will cry. And then me as a parent would have to go in and figure out what it was that he needed. That was his psychology. But then it kept developing as I kept talking to him, as his father kept talking to him and providing him with the basic things that he needed, like food and shelter and warmth and cuddles. Then he started thinking about the things that we were saying. And somehow, through all the times that we've been talking to him, and also, we taught him a little bit of sign language. He learned to associate bottle or milk with a certain sign. He learned to associate more with a certain sign, and so on and so forth. So then he's building these basic fundamental blocks of language. And now he's moved through all of that to be able to construct different stories that have a beginning, middle, and end based on the TV that he watches. Yes, my son watches TV and the books that we read to him. So his psychology and all of your psychology develops very, very quickly from the moment you're born until you're about 5 years old. From there, your psychology still changes, but it changes at different levels. And even in adolescence, your psychology changes as a result of hormones and going through puberty. And then when you become a young adult, like you are in college, your psychology changes again. You get more independence, you get to meet new people, you have responsibilities to look at your class notes and so on and so forth. And then you might become a parent, and then you might become an employee somewhere. And all of those experiences change who you are fundamentally and how you think. So, developmental psychology looks at the ways that people change over the course of a lifespan. And you can examine questions from different perspectives. So, some developmental psychologists focus on infancy to toddlerhood. Other developmental psychologists focus on elementary school age children. Others focus on middle school. Other people focus on people that are retired, so over 65 years old. Other people study people during their midlife, so about 35 to 55. And during all of these different phases, there are so many things that influence how you think and why you think the way you do. And as developmental psychologists, they can use different approaches to answer their questions or to even ask their questions. So, for instance, they could use a biobehavioral approach, which focuses on biological explanations of how people develop. So, one question, for instance, could ask, does the stress hormone cortisol influence children's friendship development? And you could argue that if children are growing up in a very volatile home environment, so their parents are always arguing, always fighting, or there's a lot of financial strain in the household, these children might experience higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of stress, and that might influence the kinds of friends or even the number of friends that they develop because they're constantly under a state of stress. Social psychologists, who are also developmental psychologists, um, generally focus on how the real, implied, or imagined presence of others influences individuals' behavior. So, as a developmental psychologist, if I were one, and also a social psychologist, I might ask something like, when do people develop a racial or ethnic identity? So, when do children realize that there are different groups? And it happens a lot earlier than you think. It actually happens during infancy. Children learn who their racial in-group is based on the faces of their mom and their dad and other close family members. And when they look at faces that have a different racial or ethnic background, they know that that's different and they don't like it as infants. So I'm not saying that infants are racist. I'm just saying that infants can distinguish groups based on race because of the relationships that they have. Now, this can be an interesting question too when we think about people that are adopted outside of their race. So, what would happen then? So, let's say that there was a Black infant that was adopted by white parents. If they were only exposed to white people, then they would view white people as their in group and Black people as their out group. Would that change as they grew? Of course it would, because then they would see themselves in the mirror and realize that they were Black. And that would then influence their own racial identity. But these are all very interesting questions to ask. So I kind of jumped the gun and I talked to you a little bit about these different perspectives. Um, but I think I'm going to end the first half of the slides here so that you can get a chance to decompress, look over your notes, and we will come back on this slide. So I'm going to end the show and I'll come back on this slide.